So how long have you been doing this series?
It's our 23rd lecture, ma'am. We established
20.
this group on April 2024.
Okay.
So from that time to till
So just this year then, is it?
yes, ma'am. Just
Okay.
this year.
And how many, who are the audience usually? Who's the audience for this? Students?
Uh, yes, ma'am. Basically, the student and sometimes other professors also
Join. Okay.
watching our YouTube channel or our Facebook Live.
That's nice. So how many do you get? How many people do you get every lecture usually?
We usually, ma'am, in this Gmeet, we usually join the admin panel for the recording and the live stuffs. And in YouTube lecture, the approx in every lecture, ma'am, 60 to 70, ma'am.
Okay. So people join right now and watch, and then you record. Are you recording this as well and then putting it somewhere, or
No, ma'am, we are going to live.
okay, you're doing live? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
So, Arnab, are you ready for the live session? Okay, ma'am. So let me just a brief introduction, few, then we'll start the lecture. So, good evening and namaskar to everyone. I am Ayush from Voices from the Periphery. It's a great honor to welcome you all to this lecture on narrating a life, Sheikh Abdullah and the making of modern India. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Professor Chitralekha Zutshi. Professor Zutshi, an expert on modern South Asia, has a particular focus on Islamic identities, nationalism, and historical thought, especially within the Kashmir region. Earning her PhD from Tufts University, she has extensively researched the complex interrelationships among these themes, as reflected in her widely published work in leading journals like the Journal of Asian Studies, Modern Asian Studies, the Indian Economic and Social History Review, and Economic and Political Weekly. Her latest publication, Kashmir, Oxford India Short Introduction, 2019, is a concise exploration of Kashmir's history and culture, while her acclaimed monograph, Kashmir's Contested Past, Narratives, Sacred Geographies, and the Historical Imagination, examines Kashmir's multilingual historical narratives from the 16th century to the present. This work received an honorable mention of the Ananda Kentish Komrari Book Prize. Her earlier book, Language of Belonging, Islam, Regional Identity, and the Making of Kashmir, provides an in-depth look the dynamics of Islam and regional identity in Kashmir. Additionally, Professor Zutsi edited Kashmir History, Politics, Representation, a collection of interdisciplinary scholarship on the region. She is also a contributor to the site Kashmir Connected and has discussed her scholarship on platforms like WNM News and India Today. Ma'am.
Oh, okay. So I can start speaking. All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here and welcome to everyone, whatever time zone you are in and joining us. I'm very happy to be joining this illustrious line of speakers and this, this lecture series, Voices from the Periphery. Uh, I just want to say one thing, that my latest book is actually Sheikh Abdullah, the Caged Lion of Kashmir, which just came out. So, and that's the book that I'm going to be talking about with you today. The process of kind of writing it, how I came to it, and so on. So the book, the title of the book, as I said, is Sheikh Abdullah, the Caged Lion of Kashmir. It's been published in the Indian Live series by HarperCollins. And it obviously is a biography of the very controversial, colorful, charismatic Kashmiri leader Sheikh Abdullah, who lived from 1905 to 1982. So he spans almost the entire 20th century, a very, of course, significant century. in which India gained independence, Pakistan came into existence, and Kashmir became sort of an issue between these two countries. So Sheikh Abdullah in some ways embodies that enduring but fraught relationship between Kashmir and India. Now, the question that arises is, why did I write this biography? Why should we write about, Sheikh Abdullah? What is there to learn from his life? And the answer to that question is what I'll try to delve into in this talk, while also telling you how I came about sort of how I came about kind of constructing this narrative. So I was confronted with Sheikh Abdullah almost as soon as I started working on Kashmir, and this was now in the mid to late 1990s. It was the height of the insurgency. It was very troubled times in Kashmir, and I would go to a library to start doing research, and the librarian would more often than not tell me, मैडम आपको अगर कश्मीर की तारीख पे लिखना है तो आपको सिर्फ 3 किताबें पढ़ने की जरूरत है, आपको रिसर्च वगैरह करने की कोई जरूरत है नहीं उसके आगे. So the 3 books that these librarians always told me that I was supposed to be reading were Kalhan's Raj Tarangini, which is the 12th century history of Kashmir by Pandit Kalhan, and then the late 19th century text called Valley of Kashmir by not Valley of Kashmir, I'm sorry, the Valley of Kashmir by Walter Lawrence. And the third book that they wanted me to look at was Sheikh Abdullah's autobiography, Aatish-e Chinar Ek Aap Biti, which was published posthumously in 1986. So I didn't take these people's advice. I did my own research, obviously, and collected all sorts of documents and wrote my first book, in which I had to, of course, take into account Sheikh Abdullah. But what this, from a very early period that I started research, this was 30 years ago now, I recognized how significant Sheikh Abdullah was to Kashmiris' own understanding of their history. And as I began working on my second book, which in the introduction was mentioned, Kashmir's Contested Past, in that book, I was more concerned with thinking about how Kashmiris thought about their identity, right? Thought about their past, how they constructed their past, how, and in the process, how they constructed the contours of Kashmir itself as a region. But here again, I was confronted with Sheikh Abdullah, because as far as the modern history of Kashmir was concerned, people basically saw it as being synonymous with Sheikh Abdullah's life. Right? So, and this is when I realized that I had to kind of write a biography of him. But what I also realized while doing research on my second book, which was not obviously this one, that while people thought of Sheikh Abdullah as being synonymous with the history of Kashmir, Sheikh Abdullah's life as being synonymous with the history of Kashmir, his legacy itself was extremely contested in Kashmir, right? So the older generation, so your grandparents' generation, I'm talking about you guys, if you're young people, your grandparents' generation revered him as a almost saintly leader who brought Kashmir out of its oppression and exploitation into freedom and so on. Then, my generation of people in their 40s and 50s, these people really saw Sheikh Abdullah as a traitor, as someone who had sold Kashmir out to India and forever foreclosed the possibility of Kashmiris having any kind of self-determination. And then there's the younger generation, your generation, who are in college and university and so on. And this generation has a very sort of vague idea about Sheikh Abdullah. I mean, they've heard about Sheikh Abdullah and they know that there's something, he was a problematic figure, but they don't quite understand why. Right, so there was a generational difference in the way that Sheikh Abdullah was remembered, even though everyone acknowledged that you can't really understand Kashmir's modern history without understanding Sheikh Abdullah. So I decided I wanted to look for answers to these questions I had about why his legacy was so contested. And I found that there were no biographies written about him, especially not by historian. And what I decided then was that I would, start working on this biography with the intention of kind of placing his life in a much broader context, right? Broader context, not just of Kashmir and the Indian subcontinent, but also globally, because globally, the 20th century was such a significant century in terms of ideologies, in terms of decolonization, in terms of all sorts of things, right? So Sheikh Abdullah found himself in the center of all of these things. So I, that's how I set out to write the biography, and I started research on this about 10 years ago in 2013, and I realized, of course, it's easier said than done. And what I very quickly realized is that Sheikh Abdullah himself had written very little. Right. So one of the things that biographers rely on is the writings of their subjects, the subjects of the biographies. And Sheikh Abdullah had one article here, one pamphlet there. And of course, I eventually discovered a bunch of letters, but there wasn't, substantial writing, right, by him. Now, this was simultaneously problematic for me as a biographer, but also in a sense freeing, right? Because I was not now confined to only his words to, write this biography. Because if he had written stuff, then I would be channeling his ideas. And it would be difficult for me as a biographer to extricate myself from those ideas. But since he hadn't written very much, what I found myself doing is really looking at the people around him, right? And now I mean sort of, people who are very famous and you've heard about, like Jawaharlal Nehru, Patel, J.P. Narayan, and so on. But also people who are lesser known, right? Who are Kashmiris, like Ghulam Mohammad Bakshi, Maulana Masoodi, there's G.M. Sadiq, there's P.N. Bazaz, there's a whole bunch of people. And how I ended up writing this biography then was as a generational biography of these leaders, right? Some of whom were very regional leaders, some of whom had this national presence, and how they interacted to then, create sort of the idea of India, the idea of Kashmir, and so on and so forth. So it became, so what I had to do really is then look for the private papers of all of these individuals. And, this took me sort of, across India, across the Kashmir Valley and Jammu and so on. So, I collected the private papers of many of these individuals that were not available in places like the Nehru Memorial Library, now the Prime Minister's Library, and so on. I also did a lot of archival work with government records in the National Archives of India. Since I have the privilege of working and living in America, I was also able to visit the National Archives here in Maryland and really get into sort of State Department records, CIA records, presidential papers of American president. And what I found with that is I got a very refreshing and interesting sort of outside perspective on Sheikh Abdullah and then moments in his life, right, that were very critical. But perhaps the most important source that I tapped into were oral histories that I myself collected. So these are oral histories of individuals who remembered Sheikh Abdullah, who were not necessarily. Some of them had worked very closely with him, very elderly at the time that I started, and many of them have since passed away. So I was able to record their thoughts and their voices before they passed away. So that was really important, I think, historically, for us to have those memories. So these were people who had closely worked with him, but also people who basically had, attended his rallies or, been part of the movement, but with a little bit of remove from him. They were also not just political actors at the high level, right? So they were middling level operatives. There were also, lower level workers. So for instance, I was able to find Sheikh Abdullah's security guard, a very elderly gentleman who lived in a village in the valley. And he was able to tell me, he was Sheikh Abdullah's sort of body man. So he was able to tell me about Sheikh Abdullah's, day-to-day activities. I give a little bit of texture to his life as a politician, because he was always with him. So when they went on train journeys or when they were on the plane, this guy was always with him. But he was also, apart from that, he was also able to give me the way that he's remembered, right, by his supporters, this elderly generation, of how significant he was to their very sense of being, right? So I collected these oral histories. And then the task, of course, was to stitch all of this together, which is easier said than done, especially for a historian, right? Because I have been trained as a historian. I think in terms of broader political, economic processes and ideologies. I don't think, through an individual's life necessarily. So I had to train my mind to kind of use Sheikh Abdullah's life and the lives of the people around him as a way to discuss these broader ideas and ideologies and processes and so on. So there are two sort of broad themes that run through the book, and through Sheikh Abdullah's life, obviously, since it's a biography. The first of these is the idea of prisons. Okay, so I say that in both the literal sense and the metaphorical sense. So Sheikh Abdullah was in prison for 16 years, 6 months, and 22 days. That's some kind of a record. None of the other nationalist leaders in India were in prison for this long. Not at one stint, obviously, but throughout his life, when he started as a leader in 1931, throughout till about 1973 or 4, right? So during this period, he was either the prisoner of the Dogra state, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, or in the state of Jammu and Kashmir in independent India. He was, it was prison really that catapulted him to fame, right? Because he was seen as this fearless leader who was willing to sacrifice his own freedom for the freedom of Kashmiris when he was during Dogra period, when he started leading the movement. And then, he was in prison, in exile from Kashmir, off and on throughout the 1950s, 60s, and through into the early 70s. So literally, he was in prison. He was out in the political wilderness. His memory was kept alive by his family, but his other political operatives on the ground, but also people in the shrines of Kashmir, right? So he was in prison literally, but metaphorically as well. Because if you think about Sheikh Abdullah and the way that he understood himself and his role as a political leader, he always saw himself as a leader of Kashmiris. He did not ever imagine himself as a leader in a wider sense, right, of Kashmiri Muslims. He when he conceived of the idea of the Kashmiri nation, he always thought of it again as in terms of the Kashmir Valley. So Jammu and Ladakh, which were part of the princely state and then the independent state of Jammu and Kashmir, did not form any part of his understanding of Kashmiri nationalism. So he remained very narrow, and in a sense, he remained a prisoner of the Kashmir Valley, right? In his understanding of his own role, in his understanding of the idea of the Kashmiri nation, to which he gave voice, by the way, right? I mean, he's the one who quite literally created the idea of Kashmir as a nation, right? So he was a prisoner. Prison is something that runs throughout as a theme runs throughout the book. The other theme, of course, is a theme of sacred spaces, and this is connected. So the sacred spaces of Kashmir, the shrines and mosques of Kashmir, is something that allowed Sheikh Abdullah to really, bring himself forward as a leader. So what he did was he understood the practice of Islam in Kashmir, which is very shrine based, and the shrines are really, sites of political organization. And he was able to very deftly utilize these shrines to present himself as the leader and to marginalize the earlier religious leadership, right, of Kashmir. So what he did was that he used the Islamic idiom to put forward a message of social and economic justice, political representation, and freedom. Right? So he was um, very deft in bringing these together. Right? So he would recite at every, if you went to any of his rallies in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even later, he would recite verses from the Quran at the beginning, and then he would quote a poem by Muhammad Iqbal, whom he thought of as one of his mentors. And then he would go into whatever issue it is that he was talking about. And he used sort of, you know, Arabic, Urdu, Kashmiri interchangeably. And he was very, very gifted speaker. Right? So he was able to mobilize people um, as a result of being, using these sacred spaces and their pulpits as a way to spread this message of freedom for the Kashmiris. And of course, these areas provided him with a vital political constituency, right? And this again, runs through. So if you think about, so 19 in the mid 1970s, when he made a deal with India and finally gave up on, the idea of self-determination for Kashmiris and so on, which he had been fighting for basically since the 1930s, his popularity was at a very low ebb. And the way that he consolidated again his popularity in Kashmir and got his constituents on his side, although not all of them, was by rebuilding the Hazrat Bal shrine, right, which dated from the time of Aurangzeb. And it was a wooden structure, and he had it demolished. He collected funds, and he, basically had the current structure of Hazrat Bal, which is in white marble, built there as a symbol of his own commitment to Kashmir, but also as a way to assert Kashmir's sovereignty and identity at a time when he had made this deal with India. So he used the sacred spaces. What I'm trying to sort of say is that he used sacred spaces in Kashmir throughout his political career. And so those are a very significant that's a very significant theme that runs through the book. Now, if you think about Sheikh Abdullah, there are a few moments that come to mind. So, for instance, in 1947, let's start with 1931, when he began the movement and founded the All Jammu and Kashmir Muslim Conference. Then the next moment is in the late 1930s, when he changed the name of the Muslim Conference to the National Conference, because what he had started doing at that time is allying with the Indian National Congress. Right? And Sheikh Abdullah was one of these regional leaders, of which there were many in the subcontinent at the time, who were fierce Indian nationalists. Right? I mean, he was a Kashmiri nationalist, of course, but he was also an Indian nationalist. And he really saw, and he really believed in the project of India, right? This impending free India that was going to come into existence, and his place, not his place, but Kashmir's place in it. And he truly believed that India would be a federation of states in which Kashmir would be one state that could have a lot of autonomy to carry out its function, what would remain under the umbrella of India. But of course, as we know, the partition of Punjab and Bengal that led to the creation of Pakistan put paid to these dreams. I mean, once that happened, there was no more that room for the federation of states, right? The federal idea died when that happened. And Sheikh Abdullah realized that Sheikh Abdullah was actually in prison, the Dogra prison, in 1947 when the partition plan was announced. And, he said, Pakistan to Turkestan, which in Kashmiri means, Pakistan is ruin. It's going to ruin us, right? Not because he said there's anything wrong specifically with Pakistan. What he was saying is that now Kashmir was going to get caught between India and Pakistan, which is pretty much what happened. And so he realized this, and he tried, really quite hard in once he was released in September of 1947 to come to terms, right? Negotiating with India, negotiating with Pakistan, trying to see where Kashmir could have the most amount of autonomy, the most amount of ability to carry out the new Kashmir agenda, of which, he was an architect with other, other people around him. And, again, those negotiations came to nothing because, there were the tribal raids in October of 1947, and more importantly, the Punchis and the Gilgitis, they rebelled against the Dogra Maharaja, and they went their own way towards Pakistan. So the state was kind of broken up, and Sheikh Abdullah was faced with this advancing army towards the Kashmir Valley. This is when he, agreed to let the Indian army come in and agreed to the Maharaja signing of the document of accession and so on. And then, he became essentially, Sheikh Abdullah did, the head of the state in this truncated Jammu and Kashmir. And very gradually through the late 1940s, late 1940s and early 1950s, in the beginning, he was very much pro-India. And he said, India has delivered us Kashmiris from being enslaved, right? But very gradually he realized that his idea of autonomy was not something that the Indian state was willing to concede. And in the early years, as he became, more and more kind of, oppressive, he became very oppressive towards his own people. What began to happen is his popularity plummeted, and he started then speaking in terms of autonomy or freedom for Kashmir and so on. And that again, led to his arrest in 1953. Or his deposition. He was the Prime Minister of Jammu and Kashmir from 1948 to 1953, and he was, removed from office and then arrested, right? And this continued throughout the 50s and 60s. He then founded the Plebiscite Front with some of his colleagues and followers. And, ultimately he, in the 1970s realized that he couldn't carry on and that he had to come to some sort of a rapprochement with India. But in this period, in the 50s and 60s, what Sheikh Abdullah did was that he presented himself as the peacemaker between India and Pakistan, as the mediator. So he said Kashmir is the reason why India and Pakistan are at loggerheads with each other, and if the Kashmir issue is resolved in some way, then the relationship between these two countries could become much better, and they could become the force that they, were destined to be in the subcontinent and in Asia as a whole. And so he presented himself as, release me. And he went to Pakistan in 1964 under, Nehru's imprimatur to go and try to, at least get India and Pakistan back to the table. India and Pakistan, of course, had been negotiating throughout this period, right, in the 50s and 60s. but get them back to the table to perhaps come to a final kind of conclusion or resolution to this issue. And when he was in Pakistan, he was actually able to make some headway. But then Nehru died in the summer of 1964 while Sheikh Abdullah was still in Pakistan, and he came back, and after that, again, the issue kind of unraveled, um, as the Congress party sort of tried to find its own feet after Nehru's death, and they were not willing to brook any kind of talk of rapprochement, especially after, again, the 1965 war, right? So Sheikh Abdullah was arrested again in 1965 when he returned from Hajj, because he had been going around European capitals and so on, talking about Kashmir self-determination and so on. And ultimately, as I said, he realized, and this was after the 1971 war, Bangladesh war, where East Pakistan sort of declared its independence and became Bangladesh, and Pakistan was cut to size, that Pakistan no longer could be a party in this dispute in ways that he wanted, and so he decided that he was going to come to a rapprochement with Indira Gandhi, with India, and signed an accord. And in some ways, it's this accord that he signed that has tarnished his legacy, because it was seen by many of the younger generation at that time, who had sort of revered him, who had been fed on his ideas of self-determination, right, throughout the 50s and 60s. They had come of age thinking about Kashmir, almost at the cusp of achieving this goal of self-determination, of reuniting with the parts that were in Pakistan and so on, that this was the end, right? That he and several people told him that this was the moment for him to sort of step back, perhaps, and take on the role of just an advisor, rather than sort of put himself into the position of chief minister, because this was really diminished the way that people thought of him and all of the things that he had done thus far. And he didn't take that advice. He became the chief minister of Kashmir. And in that period, from 1975 to 1982, when he died, he basically kind of, tried to reestablish his bona fides with the Kashmiri people. And one of the ways he did this was by constantly kind of, just coming into conflict with the center, right? In terms of, what he wanted to do with his agenda and so on. So he was constantly, the center and state were at loggerheads with each other. And it was in this moment in the late 1970s that he penned his autobiography, Atish Chinar Ek Aap Biti, which is a way for him to resurrect his legacy. Right? So it's sort of this text in which he presents himself as synonymous with the modern history of Kashmir. So, without me and my organization, the National Conference, Kashmir, as we know it, wouldn't have existed. Right? In fact, he claims that his text, Atish-e-Chinar, which, by the way, was narrated, he, did not write it. It was narrated to his amanuensis and put together after his death. But the entire text is about him basically explaining his actions and showing this generation that he didn't sell out, that he did, in fact, that he does, in fact, represent the freedom and freedom from exploitation and freedom from freedom from exploitation, freedom from political repression, and so on. And yet, ironically, of course, his two administrations from 48 to 53 and then 77 to 82 were one of the great, biggest repressors of their people's, his people's right. So he died a very broken man, a disappointed man who, hadn't achieved what he set out to achieve. when he established this organization in the early 1930s, and basically was, in prison for, as I said, for almost 2 decades for this cause. And so his legacy, again, this is the reason, I think, in part, that his legacy is so contested, and the way that he's remembered is so, contested. And one of the things that I'm going to say, and I'll end with this, is that, Sheikh Abdullah embodied this sort of crisis, right, of being both Kashmiri Muslim and then being also, Indian and secular. And he claimed that he was both, and he was both. I mean, he truly, as I said, he truly believed in the promise of India in throughout the 1930s, late 30s through to the 40s. And he said, in fact, there's a biography of him written in the mid 1930s called Kashmir Ka Gandhi. Right? So he claimed to be the Muslim equivalent of the Gandhi, right? So he said, Gandhi never eschewed his Hindu identity, and yet nobody questioned the fact that he was an Indian nationalist, right? And he said, I'm the same way. I'm Muslim, and that's where all of my ideas, come from. But at the same time, I'm also secular, and I believe in a plural Kashmir and its place within an India, right? So he was very, he was very kind of open about this. But these two identities, right, Kashmiri Muslim and Indian, were very difficult to reconcile, especially in the post-independence period. At one time, Indian nationalism was capacious enough to, in fact, include these ideas, but then it became harder and harder. In particular, when in the immediate post-independence period, one of the reasons that Sheikh Abdullah soured so much on the Indian state was because this campaign that was led by the Praja Parishad and the Jan Sangh against him and against Nehru's policies on Kashmir. And Sheikh Abdullah felt cornered and felt that he was being attacked only because he was a Muslim and so on. That was not the only reason. Of course, he himself was responsible for a lot of things that were happening. For instance, he was completely ignoring the demands of Jammu and Ladakh, which is what allowed these movements to emerge in the first place. But nonetheless, the point from his perspective was that he felt cornered as a Muslim, and he didn't feel that it was possible for him to be a Muslim and Indian at once, right? So these, even though he tried and so on, he failed, and so this tension within his political personality between being a leader of Kashmiri Muslims and being secular Indian nationalist, perhaps was a fault line that really couldn't be bridged by him. There are, of course, a lot of other fault lines, the regional fault lines within Kashmir. As I said, he focused so much on the Kashmir Valley that he ignored Jammu and Ladakh, and that allowed these movements against his authority to emerge, which he then repressed, which made them worse. And so there were a lot of these factors that eventually led to the basically some of the failures of his political career, and the deep sense of regret that he had on his deathbed. So I'm gonna stop there and let you ask questions if that's possible in this forum.
So thank you, ma'am, for this astonishing lecture. So I also read a little bit about Kashmir by 3 books. One of it is obviously Rasta Rangini. Second one is yours, Kashmir Contested Past, and third one is Professor Midurai's Hindu Rulers and Muslim Subject, that book. But now I am very much interested about this book also. So I will definitely collect this book. So Apart from that, we will now take some questions from our YouTube. So let me check.
Okay.
So Mariam is asking one question
Mhm.
that Baudelaire's concept of simulation and hyperreality suggests that historical figures often become simulacra, symbols detached from their original meaning and used to construct idealized narratives. To what extent has Sheikh Abdullah been simulated into an icon of modern Indian identity, perhaps masking the complex, often contradictory realities of his political career?
Yeah, you're right that Sheikh Abdullah, like many other people, has been reduced to symbols, right? So, but there is not one symbol for Sheikh Abdullah, right? So he is definitely seen by a generation as a symbol of freedom, as someone who uplifted Kashmiri Muslims and so on. But then there are other generations who see him in a different light, right? But there is this kind of lack of complexity and nuance in the way that he's thought of, right? So whichever whichever sort of perspective you have, it reduces Sheikh Abdullah to these basic characteristics, either of a freedom fighter or a traitor, or you have these vague ideas about him being a secular nationalist, without really understanding sort of the very complex ways in which he was perhaps all of these things at different moments, depending on the ideologies that um, were circulating at the time, his political calculus, what was going on um, in Kashmir and the world. So yeah.
So, ma'am, thank you, ma'am, for the answer. And one question comes from our admin panel. Rakhi is asking that from a deconstructionist perspective, how might Sheikh Abdullah narrative expose contradictions in Indian secularism and democracy? Are there undecidable elements in his life story that disrupt binary oppositions like loyalty and betrayal, or self-determination and national integration?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, his life basically shows, Sheikh Abdullah, it's very interesting. One of the things I forgot to mention in the beginning is that one of my big sources for this biography were press reports, of Sheikh Abdullah and the movement and so on, whether it's in pre-partition India or in post-partition India and then in Pakistan. And the way that Sheikh Abdullah himself was engaging with his own image through these press reports. So, the press reports built him up as a secular nationalist when it suited their convenience, and then tore him down as a traitor when, of course, he didn't kind of fit that bill anymore and started questioning some of the things that India was doing. But his life really shows us the anxieties of the Indian nation state, right? Especially in the immediate post-independence period when it was consolidating itself, it was drawing out its geo body, as it were. And Sheikh Abdullah embodied this anxiety about the extent of Indian sovereignty, right? And in fact, it's um, the title of this series, Voices from the Periphery, is very much in keeping with Sheikh Abdullah's life, because he was a voice that was looking in from the margins and questioning India's sovereign claims, right? And now, because Kashmir was also contested with Pakistan, this made it even worse, right? Because now, some of the things Sheikh Abdullah was saying and was in contest, in contestations with the center, were happening in other parts of India, other states of India. I mean, in the Northeast, some of you were in the Northeast, you were organizing it. It was happening there as well. But in some ways, it was worse, or Sheikh Abdullah represented this crisis in much more acute ways, because Kashmir was also contested with Pakistan, and Kashmiris had an option, right? Technically, you know, had an option. They could say, okay, we don't want to be part of India, we want to be part of Pakistan. So, especially when the plebiscite was still on the table, right? This was in the until about 1954 or so. So, and he was Muslim, of course. So all of these, anxieties about the limits of Indian sovereignty really come together in the figure of Sheikh Abdullah, who is constant, throughout his life, right, either built up, right, both in Kashmir and in India, for different reasons, built up or torn down, right? Um, so yes, I mean, one of the things that my book tries to do is really look at these narratives around him and how they intersect with these, narratives of sovereignty and loyalty and or treason and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. We will take another question is very much related to this. Pallav is asking, as I like that question. Using Gramsci's theory of hegemony, can Sheikh Abdullah's life be seen as a struggle between subaltern and dominant discourses? How did Abdullah negotiate between the hegemonic Indian state narrative and the subaltern voice of Kashmir's self-identity?
Yes, it can be seen as a battle between, Sheikh Abdullah's idea of Kashmiri nationalism and then the Indian hegemonic discourse on nationalism. But it's not as simple as that, because there's this binary that's usually created, that there was a Kashmiri nationalism, that's subaltern voices, and then the Indian nationalism is hegemonic. Within Kashmir itself, Sheikh Abdullah's nationalism was hegemonic quite as much, right? And that is what, the issue is created, right? Because Sheikh Abdullah himself is never able to convince everyone of his ideology, because there are a lot of people who disagree with him, right? They disagree with him not in the sense of being pro-India, by the way, but in the sense of being pro-Pakistan in the early years, right? Or in the sense of not agreeing that the movement should be for everyone, all Kashmiris, regardless of their religion and caste and so on, right? So people so there are lots of Kashmiri Muslims who feel that the movement should be just for Kashmiri Muslims, and he pushes this national idea, right, and nationalistic agenda where he says it should be for all Kashmiris. So he alienates those people. Then he claims to speak on behalf of all of the regions of the state, but he actually ignores, Jammu and Ladakh, and carries out policies that hurt these two, these two sub-regions within Jammu and Kashmir, right? So yes, in a sense, Sheikh Abdullah's discourse is subaltern compared to India, but his own discourse is quite hegemonic as well. So you need to kind of keep that in mind. It's usually sort of the way that it's presented is anything coming out of Kashmir is subaltern. It's not necessarily the case, right? And as I said, ironically, here is someone, Sheikh Abdullah, fighting for his people's freedom and rights to free them from the oppression of the Dogras, and then ended up in his first regime oppressing his people more than the Dogras ever did, right? Because at that time he was pressing for a pro-India agenda. So Sheikh Abdullah was not always anti-India necessarily, right? So again, very complicated personality. And I think if you read my book, you will get a sense of why it's not as simple as, fighting against the sort of, hegemony of Indian nationalism and so on. At one time, Sheikh Abdullah, presented his nationalism very much within the framework of Indian nationalism. After independence, not so much, but again, at some times he felt that, Kashmir his agenda could be best implemented within India, right? So yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. We will take another last question. It's asked by Aditya Shankar Chattopadhyay. He's asking, If we apply Foucault's theory of surveillance and discipline, could Sheikh Abdullah's role in Kashmir be seen as a form of in court surveillance or control over regional dissent? Was he placed as a in quote gatekeeper to negotiate and mediate Kashmiri aspirations within the limits prescribed by the Indian state, thereby controlling and normalizing Kashmiri resistance?
Yes, most definitely. I think that he was, as I said, he was held up as being both the embodiment of this anxiety that India felt, but also seen as the only person that could solve those anxieties, right, or alleviate those anxieties. And this is the way that the Indian state has dealt with all of its margins usually, right? I mean, it's to elevate one person as being the mediator of the people's aspirations, and then working with them meaning this person, in different contexts. um, and if this person doesn't follow exactly the line that the center has, tearing them down, right? And then building them back up again. So this is this tearing down, building up, tearing down, building up, that's going on with Sheikh Abdullah as well. And Sheikh Abdullah himself, yes, to an extent, he's working within the boundaries that are set up by India, and carries out this very much a discipline and surveillance state in Kashmir under his rule, especially the first time, 48 to 53. But then at other times he pushes back against that as well, which is why he's toned down, right? I mean, so sometimes he goes beyond those limits that are set by the Indian state within which he can function, right? So he starts questioning it. He founds the plebiscite front and he says, Kashmiris have the right to self-determination. That's when he's pulled down and called a traitor, put in prison, but then resurrected again. If you read the writings of any number of leaders, right, throughout the 60s and 70s, they're all saying Sheikh Abdullah is the only person that can deliver Kashmir to India. I mean, that's what Nehru believed fervently in the 40s, which is why he cultivated Sheikh Abdullah and his organization in Kashmir. And then even later, when plebiscite was off the table, everyone was saying there's just this one person, without recognizing, right, the complexities of the political landscape in Kashmir, which by the 60s, mid 60s, had already shifted considerably away from Sheikh Abdullah, right? So there was this there's this kind of blinders that the center has had to the complexities of the politics, and so to again resurrect him in the 70s and make him chief minister, and without recognizing how again, as I said, the political context completely changed, and there was a whole new generation of more radical leaders that had emerged in Kashmir without recognizing that. And it really was sort of made to not work out, right? And it's no surprise. I mean, it's after Sheikh Abdullah passes away in 1982 that the entire situation sort of unravels, right? And gradually, by the mid to late 80s, Kashmir is in the throes of an insurgency, right? And it's in part because of his legacy, really. This constant, this thing that he did of, building up his own constituency, building up the Indian constituency, never quite, sort of committing to either side, and creating these, divides within Kashmir itself. By that I mean the state of Jammu and Kashmir, that are present today. I mean, if you see the election results in the legislative assembly elections, I mean, they're just along these same lines. The Kashmir Valley votes for the National Conference, the BJP is voted for in Jammu. And so, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am, for this interactive session and for the explanation lecture. Personally, I am very much interested about this topic now. because because I am student of medieval Indian history, so I am not that much familiar of these topics. But from this lecture, I learned a lot, and I will definitely collect the book. And again, ma'am, thank you for joining us and for the astonishing lecture. Thank you, ma'am, for
Thank you
this.
so much for having me. And there are actually a lot of parallels, as I said, between Kashmir and the Northeast. So that might be another reason for you to delve into this topic.
Yes, ma'am. Because in Northeast also because the Northeast as a term as a kind of peripheral, because it's
Yes,
not the
exactly.
North, it's the Indian government trying to say it's
Right,
Northeast.
right.
So, thank you, ma'am. Thank you again. Okay, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Good night, ma'am.
Good night.